Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the crisp white halls of a 1950s American hospital, into starched uniforms, softly ticking clocks, and the quiet, steady hands of the woman who kept the whole place running long before anyone thought to call it a system. We're talking about what it was really like to be a nurse in 1950s America, the quiet backbone behind every doctor, every recovery, every late-night shift that nobody wrote songs about. Before we get into it, thank you so much to the viewer who suggested this one. Your ideas keep shaping where this channel goes, and honestly, some of the best episodes on here started with a comment just like yours. If you are enjoying these evenings together, a like or a subscribe helps more than you would think, and if you would rather listen than watch, we are now on Spotify too. Just check the link in the description whenever you want to take this channel with you. Now go ahead and dim the lights. Put on a fan if you have one, just for that soft hum in the background. Pull the blanket up, get settled, because this one is a slow, gentle walk through a world of rubbing alcohol and quiet competence. What did it actually feel like to pin on a nursing cap for the first time? What did the ward smell like at 6 a.m. before the doctors arrived? What did it take to comfort a frightened patient with nothing but your voice and a steady hand? What did nurses talk about in the break room in those rare stolen 10 minutes? What did it mean to be trusted with someone's life before you were even trusted to vote in certain elections? And just like that, it is 1954. The hallway lights hum overhead. Somewhere down the corridor a cartwheel squeaks. Your shift has just begun. Let's start at the very beginning. The morning you pinned on your cap for the first time. It sat strange on your head, stiff with starch, a small white flag announcing to the world that you were now someone people could lean on. You stood in front of the mirror in the dormitory, hands trembling slightly, and felt the full weight of what that little piece of fabric actually meant. The dormitory room was small, shared with 2 other girls who were just as nervous as you, their footsteps quick and uneven across the wooden floor as they too tried to get everything just right. A single window let in the pale grey light of early morning, the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it actually is. Somewhere down the hall a radiator clanked to life, filling the silence with its familiar metallic rhythm, and you found yourself grateful for the sound, grateful for anything that reminded you the world was still turning normally, even as your own world felt like it was tilting towards something enormous. Your uniform hung on the back of the door the night before, pressed so carefully it looked almost sculptural. The white so bright it seemed to glow faintly in the dim room. You had ironed it twice, though it hadn't needed it the second time, simply because your hands needed something to do while your mind raced through everything you had learned and everything you feared you hadn't. The apron ties felt foreign against your fingers as you fastened them, a small ritual that would, within a matter of weeks, become as automatic as breathing. The cap itself came last, and it was heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in meaning. You had practiced pinning it the night before using bobby pins borrowed from a girl down the hall, tilting your head this way and that in the mirror until it sat just so, angled slightly forward the way your instructor had shown you, a small crown for a job that offered no throne. Your hands shook as you slid the final pin into place, not from cold, though the room was chilly, but from the sudden dizzying awareness that you were no longer simply a student. You were, as of this moment, expected to know things, expected to be trusted with things. You caught your own eyes in the mirror and barely recognized the person looking back. She looked older somehow, more composed than you felt inside, as though the uniform itself had reached in and rearranged something in your posture, your expression, the way you held your shoulders. It is a strange thing how clothing can do that, how a piece of fabric and a few careful pins can transform a nervous girl into someone who looks, at least on the surface, entirely capable. Down the hallway, other doors opened and closed in quick succession, The soft murmur of voices rising and falling as your fellow trainees made their own final adjustments. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else exhaled a long, shaky breath that you recognized instantly, because you had just done the same thing yourself. There is a particular kind of solidarity that exists among people about to walk into something they do not yet fully understand, a quiet camaraderie built entirely out of shared uncertainty, and you felt it now, thick in the hallway air alongside the smell of starch and coffee drifting up from the kitchens below. You walked toward the stairwell with your chin lifted slightly higher than usual, partly out of nerves and partly because you'd been told more than once that posture mattered here. Confidence, even borrowed confidence, was part of the job before you had earned the right to feel any of it honestly. The wooden banister was cool beneath your palm as you descended, each step echoing faintly in the quiet stairwell, and with every step you felt the cap on your head shift ever so slightly, a gentle reminder of its presence, of its weight. At the bottom of the stairs, the head nurse was waiting, clipboard in hand, her own uniform so crisp it seemed to have been carved rather than sewn. She looked each of you over with a practiced eye, checking hems, checking collars, checking the angle of your caps without ever seeming to move her gaze too obviously. When she reached you, she paused for just a moment longer than she had with the others, and you braced yourself for correction. Instead, she simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and moved on down the line. That single nod felt like the first real thing anyone had given you all morning, more valuable in that instant than any diploma or certificate could have been. It told you, without a single word, that you had done something right, that perhaps you belonged here after all. You would wear that cap for years after this morning, through countless shifts and countless patients, through nights so long they blurred into the mornings that followed, but you would never forget the particular weight of it on that very first day. How it felt less like an accessory and more like a promise you were only just beginning to understand. It is 5:30 in the morning, and the hospital is beginning to stir before the sun has fully committed to rising. You walk the corridor in soft-soled shoes, the only sound the faint squeak of your soles against linoleum and the distant clatter of a breakfast cart being loaded somewhere below. The overhead lights are still dim to their nighttime setting, a soft amber glow that makes the long hallway feel almost gentle, almost forgiving, before the harsher fluorescents snap on for the day. You pass room after room, each door slightly ajar, each one holding its own quiet story that you will, in some small way, become part of before your shift ends. Somewhere behind one of those doors, a patient coughs softly in their sleep. Behind another, the steady rhythmic beep of a monitor marks time like a patient metronome, indifferent to the hour, indifferent to anything but the beating of a single heart it was built to watch over. You reach the nurses' station just as the night shift begins gathering their things, faces drawn with the particular exhaustion that comes from hours spent awake while the rest of the world slept. There is a quiet exchange of information here, a passing of the baton that happens in low voices and careful glances at charts. Room 4 needs watching, Room 7 finally slept through, Room 11's family arrives at 8. You absorb it all, nodding, committing details to memory the way you've trained yourself to do, because in a few hours these strangers will be your responsibility entirely. The smell of the ward at this hour is distinct from any other time of day, a mixture of antiseptic and the last lingering trace of the previous evening's disinfecting rounds, cut through now with the first faint hints of coffee brewing somewhere in the staff room. It is a smell you will come to associate years later with beginnings, with the particular hope that exists at the start of a new day, before anything has yet gone wrong or gone right. You move down the hallway toward the supply closet, collecting what you will need for your first rounds: thermometers, a fresh stack of linens, the small notepad you keep tucked into your apron pocket for jotting quick observations. The closet itself is cool and orderly, shelves lined with the tools of your trade, and there is something calming in this brief moment of solitude before the ward fully wakes, a small pocket of quiet you've learned to treasure. Outside the windows at the end of the hall, the sky's just beginning to lighten from black to a deep bruised blue, and you pause for a single moment to watch it, hands full of linens, feet already aching slightly from a shift that has not technically started yet. There is a particular kind of beauty in this transitional light, neither night nor day, that you suspect only people who work these early hours ever truly witness. The breakfast cart finally arrives on the floor, wheels squeaking their familiar protest against the linoleum, and with its arrival comes the first real wave of morning energy. Trays are distributed room by room, the smell of toast and weak coffee drifting down the hallway, mixing incongruously with the antiseptic scent that dominates everything else. Patients who have been awake for hours, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar beds, greet the sight of breakfast with visible relief, a small return to normalcy in a place defined by its abnormality. You knock softly on your first door of the day, room 4, the one the night nurse mentioned needed watching. Inside, an elderly man is already awake, propped against his pillows, watching the window with the same quiet attention you'd given the sky moments before. "Good morning," you say softly, and he turns to you with a small, grateful smile, as though your voice alone was a kind of medicine. You check his pulse, note his colour, ask the gentle, practiced questions that will tell you more than he realises he is telling you. His answers are slow but steady, and you feel a small measure of relief settle into your chest. Not every morning brings good news in a place like this, and you have learned to hold on to the small victories tightly, to let them carry you through whatever the rest of the day might bring. By the time you finish your first round of rounds, the hospital has fully woken, corridors bustling now with the movement of doctors beginning their own rounds, orderlies pushing carts, visitors arriving early with flowers clutched nervously in their hands. The quiet transitional hour has passed, replaced by the full chaotic rhythm of the day, and you find yourself already missing, just slightly, the gentle hush of those first early moments when the hospital belonged, for just a little while, only to you and the patients who could not sleep. Nobody teaches you this in nursing school, not really, but you learn it fast. You learn to walk into a patient's room and know, before they say a word, whether they are in pain, whether they are frightened, whether they simply want someone to sit with them for a minute longer than necessary. It starts with small things, the way a patient's hands rest on top of the blanket versus clenched tightly beneath it, the particular quality of silence in a room, whether it feels peaceful or heavy with something unspoken. You learn to notice the tightness around someone's eyes even when their voice remains perfectly steady, the slight shift in how they hold their shoulders when a doctor mentions test results in that careful, measured tone doctors use when they're trying not to alarm anyone. Your training gave you the vocabulary of vital signs, pulse rates, temperature readings, the clinical language of the body, but it never quite prepared you for the deeper language that exists beneath all of that, the human language spoken not in words but in small gestures, in the way a person's breathing changes when they are trying not to cry, in the particular stillness of someone who has simply given up asking questions because they are too afraid of the answers. You remember the first time you truly understood this, a young mother in the maternity ward who smiled brightly every time a doctor came through, answering every question with cheerful confidence, and yet the moment the door closed behind them, her hands would find the edge of the blanket and twist it. Over and over, a small private tell that told you everything the doctors had missed. You sat with her one evening after your shift had technically ended, and within minutes she was telling you fears she had shared with no one else. Fears about whether she would be a good mother, whether something was wrong that no one had told her. That evening taught you something essential about the work. that half of what a patient needs cannot be measured on any chart, cannot be prescribed by any doctor. It requires simply paying attention, truly paying attention, to the person beneath the diagnosis. You began developing a kind of internal catalogue over the months that followed. Small signals filed away and cross-referenced against experience. The patient who insists they are fine but keeps glancing toward the door, waiting for someone who has not yet arrived. The elderly man who jokes constantly with the staff but goes quiet and still the moment his family leaves for the evening. The teenager who claims not to be scared of the needle, but whose knuckles turn white against the sheets the moment you enter with your tray. You learn to adjust your approach accordingly, without ever making the patient feel studied or exposed. Sometimes it meant simply sitting for an extra moment before beginning a procedure, letting a patient set the pace rather than rushing through with efficient hands. Sometimes it meant filling silence with gentle conversation about nothing in particular. The weather outside, a radio program you'd heard the night before, small ordinary things that reminded a frightened person that the world beyond their illness was still turning normally. Other times it meant recognizing when silence itself was the kindest thing you could offer, sitting quietly beside someone whose fear ran too deep for words, letting your presence alone be the comfort rather than attempting to fill the room with reassurances that might ring hollow. You began to notice, too, how different patients responded to different kinds of touch, some finding comfort in a firm, steady hand on their shoulder, others flinching from any contact at all, preferring the reassurance of simple proximity instead. This, too, was something you learned only through careful observation, through paying closer attention than perhaps anyone had ever paid to you. Your fellow nurses noticed this skill developing in you before you fully recognized it yourself. The head nurse began assigning you to the more difficult cases, the patients who seemed resistant to comfort, the ones whose families struggled to reach them emotionally. You never quite understood how you managed it, only that something in you had learned to slow down, to truly look at the person in front of you rather than simply the symptoms they presented. Years later, you would still carry this skill with you, this quiet ability to read the unspoken language of fear and pain and hope that exists in every hospital room, in every quiet exchange between patient and caregiver. It became, in many ways, the truest measure of your work, more meaningful than any technical skill you had mastered, because it reminded you, again and again, that behind every chart and every diagnosis was simply a person, frightened and human, hoping someone would notice. It is 9 o'clock and the doctor is making his rounds, trailing a small procession of interns and a head nurse, who already knows exactly what he is going to ask before he asks it. You stand slightly behind, notebook in hand, having already anticipated 3 of his 5 questions. There was a particular choreography to these morning rounds, one you learned quickly and never saw written down anywhere, though everyone seemed to understand it instinctively. The doctor walked first, of course, his white coat crisp, his expression composed into the practiced neutrality that seemed to come standard with the position. Behind him came the interns, young men fresh from medical school, eager and nervous in equal measure, scribbling notes furiously as though afraid of missing some crucial detail that might later be tested, and behind them, quietly, efficiently, came you and the other nurses, the ones who actually knew the patients, who had sat with them through the night, who understood the subtle shifts in their condition that no chart could fully capture. You had learned early on the particular etiquette required of this procession. You did not speak unless spoken to, not out of any rule written into your training manual, but because of an unspoken understanding that existed throughout the entire hospital hierarchy. The doctor asked the questions, you provided the answers, when asked, in clear, concise sentences stripped of any unnecessary detail. It was not that your observations were considered unimportant exactly, simply that there was a proper order to how information flowed, and you had learned to work within it while still finding ways to ensure the things that mattered most were heard. This morning, as the group approached room 7, you felt a familiar tightening in your chest. The patient inside, an older woman recovering from surgery, had spent a difficult night, restless and in more pain than she had let on to the previous shift. You had noted it carefully in your log, along with your own observation that her wound seemed slightly more inflamed than it had been the day before, though you had chosen your words in the chart carefully, professionally, aware that a nurse's suspicions carried a different weight than a doctor's diagnosis. The doctor entered the room with his usual brisk confidence, offering the patient a brief practice smile before turning his attention to her chart. "How are we feeling today?" he asked, his eyes scanning the numbers rather than her face. She answered quietly that she was fine, the same careful, agreeable answer patients so often gave to doctors, regardless of how they truly felt, and you watched his pen move quickly across the page, already halfway toward the next room in his mind. You cleared your throat softly, the smallest of interruptions, and mentioned, in the measured tone you'd practiced for exactly this purpose, that the incision site had shown some changes overnight that you thought worth a closer look. The doctor paused, glanced toward you, and for a moment you weren't certain whether he would dismiss the comment entirely or take it seriously. To his credit, this particular doctor, unlike some others you'd worked under, actually stepped closer to examine the site himself, his expression shifting slightly as he confirmed what you'd already suspected. "Good catch," he murmured, almost as an afterthought, already reaching for his prescription pad to adjust her treatment. It was such a small phrase, offered so casually, and yet it settled warmly in your chest for the rest of the morning. Not every doctor extended even that much acknowledgement. Some moved through the wards as though the nurses trailing behind them were simply furniture, useful but unremarkable, there to execute orders rather than contribute observations. You had learned to navigate these different personalities carefully, adjusting your approach depending on who led the rounds that particular day. Some doctors welcomed your input eagerly, recognizing, as this one seemed to, that the nurses often knew the patients more intimately than anyone else on the floor. Others required a more delicate touch, comments phrased as simple observations rather than suggestions, questions posed in ways that allowed them to arrive at conclusions you had already reached hours earlier. As the procession moved on to the next room, you fell back into your quiet position, notebook ready, eyes already scanning ahead to anticipate what might be needed. There was a particular satisfaction in these small victories, moments when your careful attention translated into better care for a patient who might otherwise have waited another full day before anyone noticed what you had already seen. It was rarely acknowledged loudly, rarely praised in any formal way, but you carried these moments with you nonetheless, small proof that your presence in these rounds mattered, even when the hierarchy around you suggested otherwise. Let's step into the supply closet for a moment, a place that smelled of rubbing alcohol, clean linen, and something faintly metallic that you eventually stopped noticing altogether. Shelves lined with glass syringes, folded gauze, and bottles with handwritten labels told their own quiet story of a profession built on precision. The closet itself was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to stand comfortably side by side, yet it held within its modest walls everything required to sustain an entire ward through the chaos of any given day. You had memorized every shelf within your first month, knowing exactly where to reach without needing to look, your hands moving with the same practiced efficiency your feet had learned for the hospital's endless hallways. The glass syringes sat in neat rows, sterilized and ready, each one destined to be boiled again after use in the small autoclave down the hall, a process you performed so many times it became as automatic as blinking. There was something almost meditative about the ritual, the careful arrangement of instruments, the precise timing required, the satisfaction of instruments emerging clean and ready, for whatever the day might still demand of them. Folded linens occupied the upper shelves, stacked with a precision that bordered on artistry. Corners aligned so perfectly that a superior officer, had one existed for linens, would have found nothing to criticize. You had learned this particular skill from an older nurse during your training, a woman with decades of experience who insisted that even something as simple as a folded sheet reflected the quality of care a patient could expect to receive. Sloppiness in small things invites sloppiness in large ones, she used to say, and you carried that lesson with you long after she retired. The bottles fascinated you most, rows of them, some containing tinctures you used daily, others reserved for emergencies you hoped never to encounter, but prepared for nonetheless. Each was labelled in careful, cramped handwriting, the accumulated penmanship of pharmacists and nurses who had come before you. Some labels faded nearly to illegibility from years of handling, others crisp and new, recently added to replace supplies that had finally been exhausted. You remembered, in your early days, feeling almost overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information contained within this small space. Dosages and interactions and proper storage requirements, more knowledge packed into a single closet than you had imagined possible. Your senior nurse walked you through it patiently during your first week, explaining not just what each item was, but why its particular placement mattered, why certain medications were stored separately from others, why the most frequently needed items sat at eye level while rarer supplies occupied higher, harder to reach shelves. There was a small stool tucked into the corner, worn smooth from years of use, reserved for the rare quiet moments when a nurse might steal 5 minutes to catch her breath during an impossibly long shift. You used it more than once yourself, sitting quietly among the shelves, listening to the muffled sounds of the ward beyond the closed door, gathering yourself before returning to whatever crisis awaited you outside. The closet also held, tucked away on a lower shelf, a small collection of items that served no medical purpose whatsoever, a deck of playing cards left behind by some previous nurse, a few paperback novels with well-worn spines, a tin of hard candies that seemed to replenish itself mysteriously whenever it ran low. These small, human additions to an otherwise clinical space told their own story, evidence that the women who worked these long shifts needed small comforts too, needed reminders that they were people first, caregivers second, even in a space designed entirely around the practical necessities of patient care. You added your own contribution eventually, a small framed photograph of your family tucked behind a stack of extra pillowcases, visible only to you during those quiet moments when you retreated here for a brief respite. It became a small ritual, glancing at that photograph before returning to your rounds, a reminder of the world waiting for you beyond these walls, a world that made the exhaustion and the difficult nights feel ultimately worthwhile. Years later, long after you'd moved to other wards, other hospitals, other chapters of your career, the smell of that particular closet remained instantly recognizable to you. That precise combination of rubbing alcohol and clean linen, and something faintly metallic, a smell that instantly transported you back to those narrow shelves, that worn stool, that small hidden collection of human comforts tucked quietly among the instruments of your trade. There is always one, a face, a name, a particular way someone gripped your hand in the middle of the night when the pain was worse than anyone wanted to admit. You think of them sometimes still, decades later, wondering if they ever knew how much they taught you. For you, it was a young man who came in after a factory accident, his injuries severe enough that even the most experienced doctors on the floor spoke to each other in hushed, careful tones outside his door. He was barely older than you were at the time, and something about his particular vulnerability, the way fear flickered behind his eyes even as he tried to joke with the nurses about his terrible luck, settled into your chest in a way few patients before him had managed. You were assigned to his care during the overnight shift for nearly 3 weeks. and in that time you learned things about him that had nothing to do with his medical chart, that he had a younger sister he worried about constantly, that he'd been saving money for a small house before the accident interrupted everything, that he found strange comfort in describing, in elaborate detail, the meals his mother used to cook, as though the memory of food itself could somehow sustain him through the pain. There were nights when his pain was severe enough that sleep eluded him entirely, and you would sit beside his bed in the quiet hours, listening as he talked simply to distract himself from what his body was enduring. You learned during those long nights that sometimes the most valuable thing you could offer a patient was not medication or procedure, but simply presence, the willingness to sit quietly in the dark and listen to whatever needed to be said. His recovery, when it finally came, felt like a personal victory in a way few other patients' recoveries had. You remembered the morning he was finally discharged, how he thanked each member of the staff individually, lingering slightly longer at your station, his eyes conveying gratitude that words alone couldn't fully capture. You never saw him again after that day, though you often wondered, in quiet moments over the years, whether he had found his way back to the life he had described to you during those long nights, whether his sister had grown up well, whether he had eventually saved enough for that small house. There were others too, an elderly woman who insisted on humming old hymns under her breath throughout her entire stay, the sound somehow both mournful and comforting drifting down the quiet hallway during night shifts. A small child recovering from scarlet fever who refused to sleep unless someone held his hand, his tiny fingers wrapping around yours with a grip far stronger than his small frame suggested he should possess. You began to understand, over the years, that these particular patients, the ones who lingered in your memory long after their charts had been filed away and forgotten, shared something in common. It wasn't the severity of their illness necessarily, nor even the length of their stay. It was something harder to define, a particular quality of connection that formed in moments of genuine vulnerability, moments when the usual boundaries between caregiver and patient softened just slightly, allowing something more human to pass between you. Your fellow nurses experienced this too, you came to realize, comparing notes occasionally during quiet moments in the break room, each of you carrying your own small collection of unforgettable faces, patients whose particular struggles had left an imprint that no amount of time seemed capable of erasing entirely. It became, in its own strange way, a kind of shared language among you, an understanding that this work asked something of you beyond simple technical skill, that it required you to open yourself, again and again, to genuine human connection, knowing full well that such openness carried its own particular cost. You never regretted it, though, not even during the difficult nights when the weight of these connections pressed heavily against your chest, when you found yourself thinking of a particular patient long after your shift had ended, wondering how they were faring, hoping silently that their story continued somewhere beyond your care. These were the moments, ultimately, that reminded you why you had chosen this profession in the first place, why the exhaustion and the difficult hours never quite outweighed the strange, quiet privilege of being trusted with someone's most vulnerable moments. It is noon, and you have exactly 11 minutes before you need to be back on the floor. You sit in the small break room with 2 other nurses, sharing a thermos of coffee that has gone slightly bitter, and for just a moment, nobody needs anything from you. The break room itself was small and unremarkable, a modest table surrounded by a handful of mismatched chairs, a single window offering a narrow view of the parking lot below. Yet despite its plainness, it held a kind of sanctuary quality that made it feel, in those brief stolen minutes, like the most important room in the entire hospital. You had learned, early in your career, to eat quickly and without complaint, a habit that would follow you for decades to come, long after your working life had ended. Lunch was rarely a leisurely affair in a hospital ward, interrupted constantly by call bells and sudden emergencies, by doctors needing a chart pulled or a patient requiring immediate attention. You learned to keep something small and portable in your locker, a sandwich wrapped carefully in wax paper, an apple that could be eaten in a handful of quick bites between tasks. Today, however, was a rare gift, a brief lull in the ward's usual chaos that allowed you and 2 colleagues to actually sit down together, even if only for those precious 11 minutes. The coffee between you had been brewed hours earlier and had grown slightly bitter sitting on the small hot plate in the corner. But none of you seemed to mind, grateful simply for the warmth of the cup between your hands, for the momentary illusion of leisure. Conversation during these brief breaks rarely ventured into anything particularly deep. Small observations about patients, shared complaints about a particularly demanding doctor, occasional gossip about a colleague's upcoming wedding, or a rumour circulating about hospital administration. Yet there was comfort in this ordinary chatter, a reminder that beneath your uniforms and your professional composure, you were simply women sharing a brief moment of camaraderie in the middle of an otherwise grueling day. One of your colleagues, a nurse named Dorothy who had been working the floor for nearly a decade longer than you, always seemed to find something to laugh about, even on the most difficult days. Today she was recounting with visible amusement an incident from earlier that morning involving a particularly stubborn patient who had attempted to sneak out of his bed to smoke a cigarette in the stairwell, only to be caught by the head nurse in the act. Her retelling grew more elaborate with each detail, and despite your exhaustion, you found yourself laughing along, grateful for this small release of tension. The clock on the wall ticked steadily forward, each minute passing far too quickly, and you found yourself watching it with the particular dread that came from knowing your brief respite was ending. There was an unspoken rule among you, developed through years of shared experience, that when the clock reached its designated hour, you simply rose without complaint and returned to your duties, no matter how much you might have preferred to linger just a few minutes longer. You finished the last of your bitter coffee in a final swallow, gathered your things, and exchanged a brief, understanding glance with your 2 colleagues before heading back toward the ward. There was something almost ceremonial about this transition, the shift from momentary rest back into the demanding rhythm of patient care, a small ritual repeated dozens of times throughout your career. Walking back down the hallway, you felt slightly restored despite the brevity of your break, the simple act of sitting, however briefly, with people who understood exactly what your days demanded of you, offering a kind of sustenance that went beyond mere calories. You had learned over the years that these small moments of connection mattered more than you initially realized, that they helped sustain you through shifts that might otherwise have felt entirely overwhelming. As you re-entered the ward, already scanning ahead for whatever awaited you, you carried with you the residual warmth of that shared laughter, that brief moment of ordinary humanity amid the otherwise relentless demands of the job. It would have to sustain you until your next break, whenever that might come, however brief it might prove to be. There was an unspoken code to how a nurse was supposed to carry herself, quiet, composed, present, but never intrusive. You learned to enter a room like a soft breeze, to speak only when it mattered, and to disappear the moment your task was done. This particular skill took time to develop, and you remembered feeling awkward and uncertain during your earliest days on the ward, unsure of exactly how much presence was appropriate in any given moment. Your senior nurses seemed to move through patient rooms with an almost invisible grace, appearing exactly when needed and vanishing just as seamlessly once their task was complete, leaving behind only the subtle evidence of their care, a freshly plumped pillow, a chart updated, a glass of water refilled without anyone quite noticing when it had happened. You practiced this quality of movement deliberately at first, consciously softening your footsteps, lowering your voice to a gentle, unobtrusive register, learning to complete tasks with an economy of motion that minimized any unnecessary disruption to a patient's rest or a family's private conversation. Over time, this deliberate practice became instinctive, an almost unconscious adjustment your body made the moment you crossed the threshold into any patient's room. There was a particular delicacy required too in knowing when to remain present despite this general inclination toward invisibility. A frightened patient sometimes needed you to linger a moment longer than strictly necessary, to offer quiet reassurance even after your official duties were complete. A grieving family sometimes needed the simple comfort of your presence nearby, even if you said nothing at all, your quiet attentiveness somehow more valuable than any words you might have offered. You learned to read these situations carefully, adjusting your presence according to what each particular moment demanded. This was perhaps one of the more nuanced skills required of the profession, one that no textbook could fully teach, requiring instead years of careful observation and gradual refinement through countless small interactions. The etiquette extended beyond simple physical presence too, into the realm of what could and could not be discussed openly. You learned quickly which topics belonged strictly to the domain of doctors, prognosis, diagnosis, the technical details of treatment plans, and which topics remained appropriately within your purview as a nurse, comfort, basic care, the gentle reassurance that came from simply being attended to by someone competent and kind. There were moments when this particular boundary felt frustrating, when you possessed information or insight that felt important to share but understood, through the unspoken hierarchy that governed hospital life, that such sharing needed to happen through proper channels, filtered through the appropriate chain of communication rather than offered directly. You learned to navigate this carefully, finding ways to ensure important observations reach the right ears without ever overstepping the particular boundaries your position required you to respect. Visitors, too, required their own particular etiquette. Family members arriving to see loved ones needed to feel welcomed, without feeling as though they were intruding on hospital business, needed clear guidance about visiting hours and hospital policies, delivered with enough warmth that the rules themselves never felt harsh or bureaucratic. You developed a particular tone for these interactions over time, firm enough to maintain necessary boundaries, gentle enough that even difficult news, when you were required to deliver it, never felt needlessly cruel. You remembered too learning the particular etiquette required around death, how to move through a room where a family had just lost someone, how to offer condolences that felt genuine rather than rehearsed, how to handle the practical necessities of the moment, notifying the appropriate staff, preparing the room, all while maintaining a respectful quietness that honoured the gravity of what had just occurred. This was perhaps the most delicate etiquette of all, one you never fully mastered no matter how many times circumstance required you to practice it. Looking back, you recognize that this entire code of conduct, unwritten though it was, served an important purpose beyond mere professional decorum. It created a framework within which genuine care could be delivered efficiently, respectfully, without unnecessary disruption to the healing process each patient required. You carried this understanding with you throughout your career, this quiet appreciation for the particular grace required to be simultaneously present and invisible, essential and unobtrusive, a steady, quiet presence, moving through rooms filled with people at their most vulnerable. The hospital at night is a different creature entirely. The overhead lights dim to a soft amber, the hallways empty out, and the only sounds left are the occasional cough, the hum of machinery, and your own footsteps moving from room to room like a quiet sentry. You had grown to appreciate the night shift over time, despite the initial adjustment it required. The strange disorientation of sleeping through daylight hours and rising as the sun began its descent. There was something almost sacred about the particular quiet that settled over the ward once visiting hours had ended, and most patients had drifted into sleep, a stillness that daytime shifts, with their constant bustle of doctors and visitors and administrative activity, never quite achieved. Your footsteps echoed softly against the linoleum as you made your rounds, checking on patients whose steady breathing told you all was well, pausing occasionally beside a bed where restlessness suggested someone might need a gentle word or a small adjustment to their pillow. The dimmed lighting cast long shadows down the corridor, transforming familiar spaces into something slightly unfamiliar, almost mysterious. The ordinary daytime hospital replaced by this quieter, more contemplative version of itself. You had learned, during these long night shifts, to develop a particular sensitivity to sound, distinguishing between the ordinary hum of medical equipment and the subtle change in breathing that might indicate a patient in distress. Your ears became finely tuned instruments over the years, capable of detecting, even from several rooms away, the particular quality of a cough that suggested genuine concern rather than mere discomfort. The nurse's station during these hours felt like a small island of light amid the surrounding darkness, a single lamp illuminating the charts spread across the desk, the quiet company of one or two colleagues also working the overnight shift. You developed close friendships with these particular colleagues over the years, bonds forged through shared exhaustion and the particular intimacy that comes from working alongside someone through the loneliest hours of the night. There was a rhythm to these shifts that daytime work never quite matched. A slower, more deliberate pace punctuated by sudden bursts of urgent activity when a patient's condition shifted unexpectedly. You learned to move seamlessly between these two states, the quiet vigilance of routine monitoring and the sudden, focused intensity required. When an emergency arose, your body and mind trained to shift gears instantly regardless of how tired you might feel. The small hours between 2 and 4 in the morning held their own particular quality, a period when even the hospital itself seemed to hold its breath, when the fewest calls came through, when patients slept most deeply, and even the machinery seemed to hum more softly. You used these quiet hours for the necessary paperwork your job required, updating charts, preparing supplies for the coming morning shift, all while remaining alert to any sound that might require your immediate attention. There was also, during these long overnight hours, ample time for reflection, for your mind to wander beyond the immediate demands of your work toward thoughts of home, of family, of the life you maintained beyond these hospital walls despite the strange, inverted schedule night shift work required of you. You thought sometimes of your own bed waiting for you once your shift finally ended, of the particular pleasure of falling asleep as the rest of the world woke to begin its day. Dawn, arriving at the end of a night shift, held its own particular beauty, the first pale light creeping through the windows at the end of the hallway, gradually illuminating a ward that had spent the previous hours cloaked in gentle darkness. You watched this transition unfold countless times over the years, always finding something quietly moving in the way the hospital slowly returned to its daytime rhythm, the arrival of the morning shift bringing with it fresh energy, fresh voices, the promise of another full day beginning. You would hand off your careful notes to the incoming nurses, sharing the small details that had accumulated throughout your quiet vigil, before finally making your way home through streets just beginning to stir with early morning activity. There was something almost surreal about this particular transition, moving from the hushed, dimly lit world of the night ward into the bright, bustling world of morning commuters and opening shops, two entirely different rhythms of life existing simultaneously, each unaware of the other's particular demands. You had learned over the years small tricks for managing this particular discomfort, elevating your feet the moment you arrived home, soaking them occasionally in warm water when the ache proved especially stubborn, though none of these remedies ever fully erased the particular toll the job took on your body. Walking toward the bus stop, you passed other people finishing their own work days, office workers loosening their ties, shop clerks locking up storefronts, and you felt in these moments a strange sense of both connection and separation from them. You had all spent your day working, all felt some version of the fatigue that comes from hours of labour, yet you carried with you knowledge and experiences that felt entirely separate from their concerns, images and moments from your shift that most people never had to consider. The particular weight of having held someone's hand as they struggled through pain, of having witnessed both small recoveries and devastating losses within the span of a single day. The bus, when it finally arrived, felt like a small mercy, offering a seat where you could finally rest your aching feet, watching through the window as familiar streets passed by, streets that led toward the ordinary comforts of home, a home that felt in these particular moments more precious than perhaps it did on easier days. You watched the city lights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled deeper into evening, each window you passed representing some other life entirely. Families gathering for dinner, children finishing homework, all the ordinary rhythms of life continuing regardless of what had transpired within the hospital walls you had just left behind. Arriving home finally, you found yourself moving through your own small rituals of transition, removing your shoes first, always first, granting your aching feet their long-awaited relief. Your uniform came next, hung carefully despite your exhaustion, old habits from your training days ensuring even now, years later, that you treated your work clothes with a certain respect regardless of how tired you felt. The smell of the ward lingered faintly on your skin even after you'd changed into more comfortable clothing, a combination of antiseptic and something less definable that you'd simply grown accustomed to over the years, no longer fully noticing it yourself, though you suspected others could detect it easily enough. You often wondered whether this particular scent had become simply part of who you were now, an inseparable element of your identity as thoroughly woven into you as the skills and knowledge your years of practice had instilled. Dinner, when you finally managed to prepare it, felt like another small ritual of return. The simple act of cooking something for yourself, tasting flavours that had nothing to do with the sterile efficiency of hospital life, offering a gentle reminder that you existed as a person beyond your professional role, however deeply that role had come to define you. You ate slowly, savouring this small pleasure, allowing the tension of your long shift to gradually loosen its grip on your shoulders. Later, settling into bed, your body finally beginning to fully register its exhaustion, you often found your mind still lingering on particular moments from your shift. A patient's grateful smile, a difficult diagnosis delivered to an anxious family, the particular satisfaction of watching someone recover well enough to finally go home. These images would follow you into sleep most nights, dissolving gradually into whatever dreams awaited you, only to be replaced tomorrow by an entirely new set of moments, new patients, new small victories and quiet sorrows, the endless ongoing rhythm of a life dedicated to caring for others, regardless of what toll it continued, quietly, persistently, to take on you. There was a whole vocabulary that lived only inside hospital walls, shorthand scribbled on charts, glances exchanged across a bed that said more than words could. You learned to speak this second language fluently within your first year, and it became as natural to you as breathing. It began with the abbreviations themselves, small clusters of letters that meant nothing to an outsider glancing over your shoulder, but carried entire instructions within their compact form. You remembered struggling with these during your training, poring over reference cards late into the night, determined not to embarrass yourself in front of the senior staff by misreading a doctor's hurried notation. Within months, though, you found yourself reading and writing this shorthand without conscious thought, your pen moving across a chart with the same fluency you once reserved for ordinary conversation. But the deeper language, the one that truly mattered, existed beyond any written abbreviation. It lived in the glances exchanged between nurses across a patient's bed, a subtle lift of the eyebrows that meant watch this one closely, a slight shake of the head that meant not now, wait until the family has left the room. You learn to read these silent signals as fluently as spoken words, developing an entire relationship with your colleagues built on shared glances and understood silences that required no explanation. There was a particular tone of voice too, reserved specifically for delivering difficult news, pitched low and steady, carrying warmth without false cheerfulness, honesty without unnecessary bluntness. You practiced this tone deliberately at first, listening carefully to how your senior nurses modulated their voices when circumstances required it, gradually absorbing the particular cadence until it became simply another tool in your professional repertoire, deployed instinctively whenever the situation demanded it. Even silence itself carried different meanings depending on context, you came to realize. The silence that followed a doctor's grim diagnosis differed entirely from the peaceful silence of a patient, finally resting comfortably after days of pain. You learn to distinguish between these different qualities of quiet, adjusting your own presence accordingly, knowing when stillness required your gentle intervention and when it simply needed to be respected and allowed to continue undisturbed. Your fellow nurses developed their own particular phrases too, small verbal shortcuts that emerged organically through shared experience, phrases that would have meant nothing to someone outside your immediate circle but carried entire paragraphs of meaning among yourselves. A rough night became simply one of those nights, spoken with a particular weariness that conveyed everything without requiring further elaboration. A patient who had passed away peacefully might be described as having had a good ending, a phrase that outsiders might find strange applied to death, but which carried, among your colleagues, a specific and comforting meaning, an acknowledgement that suffering had ceased gently rather than violently. You learned too the particular language required when speaking with families, how to translate the clinical terminology doctors used into words that offered clarity without overwhelming already frightened people with unnecessary complexity. This translation work became one of your most valued skills over time, doctors sometimes deferring to you specifically to explain a diagnosis or procedure in terms a worried spouse or parent could actually absorb and understand. The language extended even to touch itself. You realized eventually different pressures and gestures carrying their own particular meanings within the physical vocabulary of patient care. A firm, steady hand on a shoulder communicated reassurance during a painful procedure. A lighter touch, barely more than a brush of fingers against a wrist, often served simply to remind an anxious patient that someone remained present, attentive, aware of their fear even without words being exchanged. You remembered training a new nurse years into your own career, watching her struggle initially with this entire unspoken vocabulary the way you once had, fumbling over abbreviations, missing the subtle glances exchanged between more experienced staff, speaking too loudly or too clinically in situations that called for gentler communication. You found yourself, in teaching her, articulating things you had never consciously examined before, surprised at how much of your daily work depended on this elaborate, largely invisible language you'd absorbed so gradually, you had nearly forgotten you once lacked it entirely. By the time she'd spent a full year on the ward, you noticed the transformation in her, the same transformation you recognized in yourself from years earlier, a fluency emerging in both the written shorthand of charts and the deeper, unspoken language of glances and careful silences. It was, you realized, one of the truest markers of belonging within this particular profession, this gradual acquisition of a vocabulary that existed nowhere in any textbook, taught instead through years of quiet observation and shared experience among people bound together by the particular demands of caring for others. Summer in the ward meant heat pressing against starched cotton, meant the faint sting of sweat beneath a collar that never seemed to loosen no matter how you adjusted it. Fans turned lazily overhead, doing little more than stirring warm air, while you moved room to room with a composure nobody could see cost you anything at all. The hospital's old ceiling fans, installed decades before air conditioning had become common in most buildings, offered little genuine relief during the hottest months, their slow rotation merely redistributing the same heavy, humid air throughout the ward rather than providing any true cooling. You remembered standing beneath one during a particularly brutal August, feeling the faint stir of air against your damp forehead, and recognizing, with something between amusement and resignation, that it offered more psychological comfort than actual physical relief. Your uniform, designed with little consideration for comfort during warmer months, clung uncomfortably to your skin by mid-morning. The starched collar that had felt crisp and professional at the start of your shift now damp and slightly wilted against your neck. You had learned various small tricks over the years for managing this particular discomfort, keeping a spare uniform in your locker for the longest summer shifts, applying a light dusting of powder beneath your collar each morning in hopes of extending its crispness just slightly longer into the day. The patients, too, suffered visibly during these months, their rooms growing uncomfortably warm despite the windows propped open in hopes of catching whatever breeze might drift through. You spent considerable extra time during summer shifts simply managing this discomfort, refreshing water glasses more frequently, adjusting bedding to allow better airflow, offering damp cloths to foreheads flushed from heat rather than fever alone. There was a particular quality to summer exhaustion that differed from the fatigue of other seasons, a heaviness that settled into your limbs by early afternoon, made worse by the heat radiating from the hospital's aging pipes and the general stuffiness that no amount of open windows seemed capable of fully dispelling. You learned to pace yourself differently during these months, conserving energy where possible, knowing that a 12-hour shift in oppressive heat demanded a different kind of endurance than the same shift during cooler seasons. Despite this discomfort, you maintained the same composed exterior your training had instilled in you, moving through the ward with apparent ease, even as sweat gathered at your temples, even as your feet swelled slightly within your soft-soled shoes from the combination of heat and hours of standing. Patients rarely witnessed the effort this composure required, seeing only the calm, professional demeanor you presented regardless of what your body might actually be experiencing beneath the surface. Your colleagues understood this particular struggle intimately, of course, and summer months brought with them a quiet camaraderie built around shared discomfort. Brief exchanges in the hallway often included commiseration about the heat, quick fanning gestures with whatever paperwork happened to be at hand, grateful acknowledgement whenever someone managed to locate an extra fan for the nurse's station. The evening shift change during summer months carried its own particular relief, the gradual cooling that came as the sun finally began its descent, offering some small mercy after hours of accumulated heat throughout the day. You remembered walking home during these summer evenings, grateful for whatever breeze might finally stir, your uniform still damp beneath your coat despite the cooling temperatures, carrying with you the particular exhaustion that only a full shift endured in oppressive heat could produce. Even now, years later, the particular combination of summer heat and starched cotton against skin remained instantly evocative for you, capable of transporting you immediately back to those long, humid shifts, the ceiling fans turning uselessly overhead, the quiet, shared understanding among you and your colleagues that this particular discomfort was simply another aspect of the job to be endured with whatever grace you could manage, regardless of how deeply it wore on you by the end of each long day. Some of them called you nurse, plainly, without ever bothering to learn what came before it. You answered anyway, quietly, professionally, because the patient in front of you needed care far more than you needed recognition, though some part of you kept a private list of who noticed and who didn't. This particular slight, small as it might have seemed to an outside observer, accumulated its own quiet weight over months and years of practice. You worked alongside dozens of physicians throughout your career, some who took the time within their first week to learn not only your name but small details about your background, your training, your particular strengths as a caregiver, and others who addressed you for years exclusively as nurse, as though the specific person fulfilling that role mattered less than the function itself. You remembered, early in your career, feeling genuinely hurt by this particular dynamic, taking it personally when a doctor you'd worked alongside for months still fumbled for your name during an emergency, resorting instead to the generic title that erased your individual identity entirely. Over time, though, you learned to understand this pattern as symptomatic of something larger than any individual doctor's personal failings, a broader hierarchy within medicine that positioned nurses, however skilled and essential, as somewhat interchangeable within the larger machinery of patient care. This understanding didn't entirely erase the sting, but it did help you develop a kind of protective distance from it, a recognition that your worth as a caregiver existed independently of whether any particular doctor bothered to learn your name. You focused instead on the patients themselves, who almost universally learn your name within their first conversation with you, who thanked you by name when you helped them through difficult procedures, who remembered you specifically among the various hospital staff who passed through their rooms during their stay. There were exceptions among the doctors, of course, physicians who treated the nursing staff with genuine respect and collegial warmth from their very first interaction. You remembered one doctor in particular, older and more experienced than most of his colleagues, who made a point of learning not just your name but the names of every nurse on his rounds, who consulted your observations genuinely rather than merely tolerating them, who occasionally thanked you specifically after a particularly difficult case, acknowledging the crucial role your care had played in a patient's recovery. These particular doctors became, in their own quiet way, models for how you hoped medicine might eventually evolve, a vision of collaborative care where the contributions of nurses received genuine acknowledgement rather than being subsumed entirely within the doctor's own credit. You noticed gradually that the younger physicians entering the profession seemed slightly more inclined toward this collaborative approach than some of their older counterparts, and you allowed yourself small moments of quiet hope that the profession might be slowly shifting toward greater mutual respect. In the meantime, you developed your own quiet methods of maintaining your sense of professional identity despite this occasional erasure. You signed your notes carefully and legibly, ensuring that even if a doctor never bothered learning your name in person, the written record of your observations carried unmistakable attribution. You took quiet pride in becoming known, among your nursing colleagues at least, for particular skills and strengths, your steady hand during difficult procedures, your particular gift for calming frightened children, your reliable thoroughness in documentation that other nurses often relied upon when picking up a shift you had previously covered. You also found unexpected comfort in the relationships you built with patients themselves, relationships built entirely around your specific identity rather than your generic professional function. Patients remembered you specifically long after their hospital stay had ended, sometimes returning years later for entirely unrelated treatment and asking specifically whether you still worked on the floor, whether you might be available to assist with their care once again. This particular form of recognition, though quieter and less immediately visible than professional acknowledgement from physicians, ultimately meant more to you than any doctor's belated recollection of your name ever could. It reminded you that your work, regardless of how the broader hospital hierarchy positioned it, made a genuine and lasting difference in the lives of the people you cared for, an impact that persisted in their memory long after any particular doctor's involvement in their case had faded into vague, generalized recollection. The nurse's station was its own small world, a hub of clipboards, ringing phones and quiet laughter, shared between women who understood each other in a way almost no one else could. It was here, in stolen moments between calls, that friendships formed strong enough to outlast entire careers. The station itself occupied a central position within the ward, a semicircular desk positioned to allow clear sightlines down each of the connecting hallways, ensuring that whoever staffed it could monitor the various call lights that might illuminate at any moment, signalling a patient's need. Despite its purely functional design, the space had gradually accumulated small personal touches over the years. A chipped mug bearing someone's initials, a small potted plant that somehow survived despite inconsistent watering, a handwritten calendar marking upcoming birthdays and anniversaries among the staff. You spent countless hours at this particular desk throughout your career, updating charts, answering the persistent ring of the telephone, coordinating with other departments regarding test results or scheduling. Yet despite the purely administrative nature of much of this work, the station itself became, over time, something far more significant than its practical function alone might suggest. A genuine gathering place where the particular bonds of your profession found space to develop and deepen. You remembered the specific rhythm of conversation that developed during quieter moments at the station, brief exchanges about patients that gradually expanded into more personal territory, questions about a colleague's family, updates on a wedding being planned, quiet commiseration about a particularly difficult supervisor. These conversations rarely lasted more than a few minutes before some new demand pulled you back toward your official duties, yet their brevity somehow made them more meaningful rather than less. Small windows of genuine connection carved out of an otherwise relentlessly busy day. The friendships that developed through these fragmented conversations possessed a particular intensity that surprised you initially. Bonds formed not through leisurely socializing, but through shared crisis, mutual exhaustion, and the particular intimacy that comes from working alongside someone through the most vulnerable moments of other people's lives. You found yourself confiding things to certain colleagues that you might not have shared even with close friends outside the hospital. An understanding between you built on the shared foundation of witnessing together both the triumphs and tragedies that defined your daily work. There was a particular nurse, a woman named Helen, who had trained alongside you from your very first days on the ward, with whom you developed perhaps the closest friendship of your entire career. You had supported each other through countless difficult shifts, celebrated together during moments of genuine professional triumph, and comforted one another during the inevitable losses that came with caring for patients who did not always survive their illnesses. Your friendship extended naturally beyond the hospital walls eventually. Family dinners shared, holidays celebrated together, a connection that persisted long after either of you had moved to different departments or different hospitals entirely. The nurses' station also served as a kind of informal training ground for newer staff, a place where more experienced nurses like yourself could offer guidance and reassurance to those still finding their footing within the profession. You remember taking particular pride in mentoring younger nurses during quiet moments at the desk, sharing small pieces of hard-won wisdom, reassuring them during difficult days that the particular exhaustion and emotional weight of the job would become, with time, more manageable, even as it never entirely disappeared. Holidays spent working at the station carried their own particular poignancy. A small group of nurses gathered together while the rest of the world celebrated at home, finding comfort in each other's company even as you each privately missed your own families. You remembered several Christmas Eves spent this way, sharing small gifts exchanged among yourselves, a modest meal prepared collectively in the small kitchen down the hall, finding genuine warmth and connection despite the circumstances that kept you from your own celebrations. Looking back across your entire career, you recognized that the nurses' station represented something far more significant than its modest physical presence might suggest. a genuine centre of community within an otherwise demanding and often isolating profession. The friendships forged there, tested repeatedly through shared crisis and mutual support, became some of the most enduring and meaningful relationships of your entire life. Bonds that persisted long after retirement had finally brought your years of nursing work to their eventual close. Not every patient could be fixed, and this was perhaps the hardest lesson nursing school never quite prepared you for. You learned instead to sit beside someone in their fear, to hold a hand that trembled, to offer presence when medicine had nothing left to give. This particular lesson arrived gradually rather than through any single dramatic moment, accumulating slowly through repeated exposure to patients whose conditions extended beyond what medical intervention could genuinely resolve. Your training had emphasized, understandably, the technical skills required to heal, proper procedures, correct dosages, careful monitoring of vital signs, all oriented toward the fundamental goal of restoring patients to health. What this training rarely addressed directly was what remained of your responsibility once that particular goal became impossible to achieve. You remembered your first experience with this particular reality clearly, an elderly patient whose illness had progressed beyond any treatment's ability to reverse, whose remaining time had narrowed to days rather than years. The doctors, having exhausted their available options, gradually reduced their visits, their attention necessarily redirected toward patients whose conditions still responded to intervention. Yet the patient herself remained, still frightened, still in need of care despite the absence of any remaining medical solution to her situation. You found yourself, during this particular case, drawing on skills your formal training had touched on only briefly, the simple but profound work of providing comfort in the absence of cure. You learned to sit beside her bed for extended periods, offering conversation when she seemed to want it, comfortable silence when words felt unnecessary or unwelcome. You held her hand during moments of particular fear, adjusted her pillows not because doing so would improve her medical outcome, but simply because comfort itself carried its own value, regardless of whether it contributed to recovery. This experience taught you something essential that would inform the remainder of your career, that your role extended meaningfully beyond the strictly medical, that comfort and presence constituted their own form of care, every bit as legitimate and necessary as any procedure or medication you might administer. You began approaching all your patients with this broader understanding, recognizing that even those whose conditions responded well to treatment still benefited from this additional dimension of care, the simple reassurance of knowing someone remained attentive to their fear and discomfort beyond the purely clinical aspects of their treatment. You developed particular techniques over the years for providing this kind of comfort effectively, learning to modulate your voice to convey calm reassurance even during genuinely frightening circumstances, developing a repertoire of gentle physical gestures, a hand on a shoulder, a steady grip during a painful procedure that communicated care without requiring words. You learned too the particular importance of simply staying present during difficult moments, rather than retreating into brisk efficiency, understanding that your continued presence itself carried therapeutic value even when no further medical intervention remained available. Families too required this particular form of comfort, especially during moments when a loved one's prognosis had shifted from hopeful to uncertain or grim. You learned to sit with frightened spouses and children, offering what reassurance you honestly could while never providing false hope that might later prove cruel when circumstances failed to improve. This particular balance, honest without being harsh, comforting without being dishonest, required careful calibration that you refined gradually over years of practice. There were moments when this particular aspect of your work felt more emotionally demanding than any technical procedure you performed, requiring you to remain fully present with another person's fear and grief without the protective distance that clinical tasks sometimes provided. You learned various methods for managing this particular emotional toll yourself, brief moments of quiet reflection between patients, occasional conversations with trusted colleagues who understood exactly what this work demanded, small personal rituals that helped you process difficult days before returning home to your own family. By the later years of your career, you had come to view this particular skill, the ability to provide meaningful comfort even in the absence of medical solutions, as perhaps the deepest expression of what nursing actually meant. Anyone with sufficient training could learn to administer medication correctly or monitor vital signs accurately. But this deeper work, sitting with someone in their fear, holding a trembling hand, offering presence when nothing else remained to offer, required something less easily taught, a particular quality of compassion and courage that you had gradually developed through years of practice, patient by patient, difficult moment by difficult moment. Every hospital had its own particular scent, a blend of antiseptic, starched linen, and something faintly like soap that clung to the walls no matter how often the windows were opened. You would catch that same smell years later in the most unexpected places and feel instantly transported back to those long corridors. This particular olfactory signature, you came to realize over the years, remained remarkably consistent across every hospital you worked within throughout your career, as though some universal formula governed the specific combination of cleaning products, medical supplies, and institutional atmosphere that created this distinctive scent. You remembered noticing it most acutely during your very first week of training, overwhelmed initially by its unfamiliar intensity, gradually growing so accustomed to it that you eventually stopped consciously registering its presence at all, at least while actually working within the hospital walls. It was only when you left, stepping outside into the ordinary air of the street or returning home at the end of a long shift, that you would suddenly notice the scent's absence and equally its persistent presence on your own skin and clothing, evidence of hours spent immersed within its particular atmosphere. Your family members would occasionally comment on this lingering scent when you first arrived home, a gentle observation rather than a complaint, simply an acknowledgement of the particular world you'd spent your day inhabiting. The specific components of this distinctive smell revealed themselves gradually as you grew more experienced within the profession. The sharp, clean scent of rubbing alcohol used for various sterilization purposes, the softer, almost powdery smell of freshly laundered linens delivered daily from the hospital's industrial laundry facility, and underlying both of these, something less easily defined, a combination perhaps of the various soaps and cleaning solutions used throughout the building, mixed subtly with whatever food happened to be preparing in the distant kitchen at any given moment. You developed, over time, an almost unconscious ability to detect subtle variations within this general scent profile, noticing when a particular room carried an additional undertone suggesting infection, requiring closer attention, or when the specific combination of smells in another room indicated a patient's condition had improved sufficiently that certain more intensive treatments were no longer necessary. This particular sensory awareness became, in its own way, another form of the professional knowledge you accumulated throughout your career, a subtle diagnostic tool that supplemented the more obvious clinical observations you were trained to make. There were certain rooms, too, that carried their own particular scent memories for you personally, associations built through repeated exposure during significant moments in your career. The maternity ward carried a slightly different quality to its general hospital scent, something almost sweeter underlying the standard antiseptic base, perhaps simply your own emotional association with the joy that typically accompanied births, rather than any actual difference in the room's physical atmosphere. The surgical recovery ward, by contrast, carried a sharper, more clinical intensity, appropriate perhaps to the more serious nature of what patients there had just experienced. Years after retiring from active nursing work, you found yourself unexpectedly transported back to these long hospital corridors whenever you encountered even faint traces of this particular scent combination elsewhere in your daily life. A doctor's office during a routine checkup, occasionally even certain cleaning products used in ordinary household contexts. These moments of olfactory memory arrived with startling intensity, momentarily returning you to specific patients, specific difficult nights, specific quiet victories you had nearly forgotten until this particular sensory trigger brought them rushing back with unexpected clarity. You mentioned this phenomenon once to a former colleague during a chance encounter years after both of you had left active nursing, and she laughed with immediate recognition, describing similar experiences of her own, moments when an unexpected whiff of that particular institutional scent transported her instantly backward through decades of accumulated memory. This shared experience, you realized, represented another small but meaningful thread connecting everyone who had spent significant portions of their working lives within hospital walls, a sensory inheritance that persisted long after the actual daily work had ended, a permanent invisible reminder of the particular world you'd once inhabited so completely. In many hospitals, there was a quiet understanding that nursing and marriage did not always mix easily, that a wedding ring sometimes meant an unspoken expectation to step back from the ward. You watched colleagues navigate this delicate balance, some choosing one path, some finding a way to hold on to both. This particular expectation existed nowhere in any official hospital policy that you ever encountered directly, yet it operated with remarkable consistency throughout the various institutions where you worked during your career, an unwritten assumption that seemed embedded within the broader culture surrounding nursing during these years. You remembered noticing it first during your early training, observing how conversations among the senior nurses would shift subtly whenever a colleague announced an upcoming engagement. Congratulations offered genuinely, but accompanied by a particular quality of curiosity about what this news might mean for her continued presence on the ward. Some of your colleagues, upon marrying, chose to leave nursing entirely, embracing instead the domestic role that broader social expectations of the era generally reinforced as the appropriate path for a married woman. You remembered several friends from your training years who followed exactly this trajectory, marrying within a few years of completing their certification, then gradually stepping back from active hospital work as they began raising families, their nursing skills relegated afterward to occasional volunteer work or simply personal knowledge, applied within their own households. Others, however, found ways to maintain their professional identity despite marriage, sometimes through quiet negotiation with hospital administration, sometimes simply through persistence and skill significant enough that supervisors proved reluctant to lose their expertise regardless of changed marital status. You remembered one particular colleague, a woman named Ruth, who married during her third year on the ward and simply continued working without any dramatic announcement or negotiation. Her steady competence apparently sufficient to override whatever unspoken expectations might otherwise have applied to her situation. You yourself faced this particular question directly when you became engaged partway through your own career, remembering the mixture of genuine happiness and quiet apprehension you felt discussing the news with your head nurse, uncertain how this announcement might affect your continued employment. To your considerable relief, your supervisor expressed only warm congratulations without any indication that your marriage might necessitate leaving the position you had worked so hard to establish yourself within. This particular experience, however, varied considerably depending on the specific hospital and the particular attitudes of individual administrators, and you knew of other institutions where married nurses faced more explicit pressure to resign, sometimes framed as concern for their domestic responsibilities, sometimes more directly connected to persistent assumptions about where a married woman's primary obligation should lie. You felt genuinely fortunate in retrospect to have worked within an environment that allowed you the flexibility to continue your career despite marriage, recognizing that many equally skilled and dedicated nurses elsewhere face considerably more difficult choices. The question grew more complicated still once children entered the picture, an even more significant challenge to continued professional nursing work given the demanding schedules and physical requirements the job entailed. You watched several colleagues navigate this particular transition with varying degrees of success, some managing to maintain reduced hours that allowed them to balance both nursing work and motherhood, others finding the combination simply too demanding and reluctantly stepping back from active hospital work until their children reached school age. You remembered lengthy conversations during quiet moments at the nurses' station about exactly this dilemma, colleagues sharing strategies for managing childcare around demanding hospital schedules, discussing which supervisors proved more flexible regarding scheduling accommodations, offering mutual support and understanding for a challenge that broader society at the time offered relatively little formal assistance in addressing. These conversations, though sometimes tinged with genuine frustration at the limited options available, also carried a particular warmth, a recognition that you were all navigating similar challenges together, offering whatever practical wisdom and emotional support you could muster for one another. Looking back across your career, you recognize that this particular tension between professional identity and traditional domestic expectations represented one of the more challenging aspects of building a lasting nursing career during this particular era. Yet you also took considerable pride in having navigated it successfully yourself, maintaining both your marriage and your professional identity across decades of continued work, proof that the two need not remain as mutually exclusive as broader social expectations sometimes suggested they should be. There was a different kind of quiet required in the children's ward, a softness that had to live in your voice even when your hands were doing something frightening. You learned to hum gently while changing a bandage, to make a game out of taking a temperature, because fear in a child needed a gentler kind of medicine. You remembered your first rotation through the pediatric ward with particular clarity, initially uncertain how to adjust your professional demeanour to accommodate the particular vulnerability of your youngest patients. The technical skills remained largely the same, checking vital signs, administering appropriate medications, monitoring for signs of complication, yet everything about how you approached these tasks required careful recalibration when your patient was a frightened 5-year-old, rather than an adult capable of understanding the necessity behind whatever discomfort your care might temporarily require. The senior nurse who trained you during this particular rotation demonstrated a remarkable gift for transforming even the most frightening procedures into something resembling play, turning a simple temperature check into an elaborate game involving a stuffed rabbit who apparently needed the same treatment first, distracting a child from an injection's brief sting by asking detailed questions about their favourite radio program. You watched her work with something approaching awe initially, gradually absorbing her particular techniques until they became, with practice, genuinely your own. You learned the specific value of humming softly during more uncomfortable procedures, a wordless melody that somehow conveyed calm reassurance more effectively than any verbal explanation might have managed with a child too young to fully process complex medical reasoning. You developed a small repertoire of these gentle tunes over time, simple melodies that seemed to hold universal appeal among your young patients, regardless of their individual temperaments, humming softly as you changed dressings or drew blood, watching small shoulders gradually relax as the melody continued. The particular architecture of trust required with child patients differed substantially from what adult patients generally required, you came to understand. Children needed concrete, immediate reassurance rather than abstract explanations about future benefit, needed to see and touch whatever instrument you intended to use before you brought it near their skin. needed permission to express their fear openly rather than being expected to maintain the stoic composure adult patients often felt pressured to display. You learn to kneel down to their eye level whenever possible, recognizing that even this small physical adjustment helped establish a different quality of connection than towering over a small, frightened child from your full adult height. You learn to explain procedures using language appropriate to their particular age and understanding, describing a stethoscope as a special listening tool rather than launching into technical explanation of cardiac auscultation, describing an injection as a quick pinch rather than employing more clinical terminology that might increase rather than diminish their anxiety. Parents, too, required particular attention during these interactions, their own visible anxiety often threatening to intensify their child's fear if left unaddressed. You learn to speak calmly and confidently in front of worried mothers and fathers, understanding that children frequently took emotional cues directly from their parents' demeanor, that a visibly frightened parent could undermine even your most careful efforts to reassure their child directly. There were particular patients from this rotation who remained vivid in your memory decades later. A small boy recovering from a broken arm who insisted on narrating an elaborate imaginary adventure throughout his entire treatment, casting you as a fellow explorer, navigating some fantastical jungle rather than a nurse tending his injury. A young girl frightened of needles who eventually agreed to injections only if allowed to hold your hand tightly throughout the brief procedure, her small fingers gripping yours with surprising strength as you administered whatever medication her treatment required. You carried the lessons from this particular rotation with you throughout the remainder of your career, even after transferring eventually to adult wards, where these specific techniques required less frequent application. Something about the particular tenderness this work demanded, the careful attention to emotional as well as physical comfort, the recognition that fear itself required deliberate, gentle treatment, alongside whatever medical intervention a condition required, fundamentally shaped how you approach patient care more broadly, informing even your work with elderly or otherwise vulnerable adult patients who, in their own way, sometimes needed a similar quality of gentle reassurance that you had first learned to offer within those particular walls of the children's ward. Some nights you needed the walk home more than you needed sleep, needed the cool evening air to slowly separate you from everything you had witnessed inside those walls. Your feet carried you past quiet houses with lit windows, ordinary lives continuing on, unaware of the small miracles and quiet losses that had filled your day. You developed this particular habit gradually over the years, choosing to walk the 20 minutes home rather than taking the bus whenever weather permitted, especially following shifts that had proven emotionally demanding in ways that a simple bus ride felt insufficient to process. There was something about the physical act of walking, the steady rhythm of your own footsteps against pavement, that seemed to help your mind gradually untangle itself from whatever difficult moments the day had contained. The route home took you through a quiet residential neighbourhood, past modest houses with small, well-tended gardens, their windows glowing warmly with the particular light of evening domesticity. You often found yourself glancing toward these lit windows as you passed, catching brief glimpses of ordinary family life, a mother setting a table for dinner, children visible through a window doing homework at a kitchen table, a man reading a newspaper in what appeared to be quiet contentment after his own workday had concluded. There was something both comforting and faintly melancholic about these glimpses into other people's ordinary evenings, a reminder that life continued in its usual patterns regardless of whatever significant events had occurred within the hospital walls you had just left behind. You sometimes wondered, walking past these houses, whether any of their occupants had any awareness of what transpired within the hospital during a typical day, the particular mixture of hope and fear, small victories and devastating losses that filled your working hours, yet remained largely invisible to anyone not directly involved in medical care. The particular quality of evening light during these walks varied considerably depending on the season. Summer evenings offering extended golden light that seemed to soften even the most difficult memories from your shift. Winter evenings arriving already dark by the time you finally left the hospital. Streetlights casting their more clinical illumination across your path home. You noticed yourself responding differently to these seasonal variations. Summer walks generally offering more genuine comfort. Winter walks sometimes feeling colder in ways that extended beyond mere temperature. You used this particular time to process specific difficult moments from your shift, replaying conversations with worried families, reconsidering whether you'd responded appropriately to a patient's particular fear or confusion, sometimes simply allowing yourself to grieve quietly for a patient whose condition had taken an unexpected turn for the worse. This private processing time, uninterrupted by the demands of either hospital work or family obligations waiting at home, proved essential for your own emotional sustainability across years of demanding nursing work. There were particular landmarks along this route that came to hold their own quiet significance for you over time. A specific corner where you'd once paused to simply breathe deeply after a particularly difficult night. A small park bench where you occasionally sat briefly when the weight of a shift felt too heavy to carry the entire distance home without pause. These small physical markers became, in their own way, part of your emotional processing ritual. Familiar waypoints that helped structure your gradual transition from hospital nurse back into your identity as simply a woman walking home after a long day. You remembered specific evenings when this walk had proven particularly significant, following the loss of a patient you had grown especially attached to, following a difficult conversation with a family struggling to accept a diagnosis, following moments of genuine triumph too, celebrating quietly to yourself after a patient's remarkable recovery exceeded everyone's careful expectations. Whatever emotional weight the day had carried, this walk provided essential space for you to fully register and process it before arriving home, where your own family awaited with their own needs and concerns that deserved your full attention, rather than whatever residual professional preoccupation might otherwise linger. By the time you reached your own front door, keys finally turning in the familiar lock, you generally felt sufficiently transitioned to greet your family with genuine presence, rather than the distracted exhaustion that might have characterized you had you traveled home by bus instead, arriving too quickly to properly process everything the day had contained. This walk, modest and unremarkable as it might have appeared to any casual observer, represented in reality an essential ritual that helped sustain you emotionally across decades of demanding, deeply meaningful nursing work. Every so often, there was one, a doctor who paused long enough to actually hear what you had observed about a patient, who trusted your instincts even when the textbooks disagreed. Those moments felt like small, quiet victories in a world that did not often make room for a nurse's opinion. You remembered this particular doctor with unusual clarity even decades after working alongside him, a physician who joined the hospital staff partway through your own tenure there, arriving with a reputation for unusual thoroughness that initially struck some of your colleagues as excessive caution rather than genuine attentiveness. You formed your own opinion of him gradually, through repeated interactions during his rounds, noticing early on his distinctive habit of actually pausing to ask nurses direct questions about patients, rather than simply reviewing charts and issuing instructions without further discussion. The first time he genuinely sought your input occurred during a particularly puzzling case, an elderly patient whose symptoms didn't quite match any obvious diagnosis, whose condition seemed to be gradually worsening despite treatments that should theoretically have proven effective. Most doctors, you had learned through years of experience, tended to view such puzzling cases as exclusively within their own domain of expertise, consulting textbooks and specialist colleagues while treating nursing observations as merely supplementary data rather than genuinely valuable diagnostic input. This particular doctor, however, approached the situation differently, sitting down briefly at the nurse's station to ask you directly about patterns you had noticed throughout your extended observation of the patient, patterns that might not have appeared clearly within the more limited windows of time he himself spent examining her during his relatively brief daily visits. You found yourself initially uncertain how to respond to this unusual invitation, unaccustomed to having your observations solicited so directly and taken so seriously. You described somewhat hesitantly at first, gradually growing more confident as he listened attentively, the particular timing you had noticed regarding when her symptoms seemed to intensify, details about her appetite and sleep patterns that hadn't seemed significant enough to warrant formal documentation but which, described aloud now, began forming a pattern even you hadn't fully recognized until articulating it directly to him. He listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated genuine engagement with what you were describing rather than mere polite tolerance. This particular consultation ultimately proved significant in reaching an accurate diagnosis for this challenging case, the doctor later acknowledging, during a subsequent conversation, that your detailed observations had provided the crucial piece of information that allowed him finally to identify what had been eluding him through several days of more conventional diagnostic approaches. This acknowledgement, offered simply and without excessive fanfare, nonetheless meant considerably more to you than perhaps he realized, validation of a kind you had rarely received so directly throughout your career. Following this initial interaction, you noticed him consistently maintaining this same collaborative approach throughout his tenure at the hospital, regularly seeking nursing input not merely as a formality, but as genuine data essential to his diagnostic process. Other nurses noticed this same pattern in their own interactions with him, and gradually his rounds developed a distinctly different quality compared to those led by other physicians, a genuine two-way exchange of information, rather than the more typical one-directional flow of instructions from doctor to nursing staff. You appreciated too how this doctor extended similar respect toward patients themselves, taking time during his examinations to genuinely listen to their own descriptions of their symptoms and concerns, rather than rushing through a standardized set of questions before moving quickly toward his next patient. This particular quality of attentiveness, extended equally toward both nursing staff and patients, seemed to reflect some deeper personal philosophy about medicine itself, a genuine belief that accurate diagnosis and effective treatment depended on gathering information from every available source, rather than relying exclusively on the physician's own limited observations. You worked alongside this particular doctor for several years before he eventually moved to a position at a different hospital, and you remembered feeling genuine sadness at his departure, recognizing that you were unlikely to encounter many physicians who approached collaborative patient care with quite the same genuine respect he'd consistently demonstrated. In the years that followed, whenever you encountered doctors who dismissed nursing observations too readily, you found yourself thinking back to this particular colleague, holding on to the memory as proof that a different, more collaborative approach to medicine remained genuinely possible, even if it remained frustratingly rare within the broader hierarchy that generally governed hospital practice during these particular years of your career. Nursing school taught you anatomy, taught you procedure, taught you how to fold a hospital corner so tight it could survive a hurricane. But nothing in those textbooks prepared you for the particular ache of holding someone's hand as they said goodbye to the life they had known. You remembered your classroom years with a certain fondness despite their rigor. Long hours spent memorizing the names of bones and muscles, practicing injections on oranges until your technique satisfied even your most exacting instructor, learning the precise mathematics required to calculate medication dosages without a single margin for error. These skills form the essential foundation of your professional competence, and you never once regretted the countless hours devoted to mastering them so thoroughly that they eventually became instinctive. Yet you remembered too the particular disorientation you felt during your very first encounter with genuine human suffering that no amount of technical knowledge could resolve. A patient whose condition had progressed beyond any treatment's capacity to reverse, whose remaining days had narrowed to a number your training had never quite prepared you to confront directly. You stood beside her bed that first time, technically proficient in every measurable sense, yet utterly uncertain how to offer what she genuinely needed in that particular moment, which was not another procedure or medication, but simply presence, simply witness to whatever she was experiencing as her life drew toward its conclusion. Your instructors had touched briefly on this subject during your training, brief lectures about maintaining professional composure, about the importance of emotional distance in preserving your own capacity to continue functioning effectively across a demanding career. This advice, while perhaps well-intentioned, ultimately proved less useful than you had hoped when confronted with the actual visceral reality of sitting beside someone whose life was genuinely ending, whose fear and grief demanded something more authentic than mere professional composure could adequately provide. You learned, gradually, through repeated exposure to these particular moments, that genuine comfort required a delicate balance you had never encountered, explicitly taught in any classroom, remaining emotionally present and authentic, without becoming so overwhelmed by grief that you lost your capacity to offer the steady support your patients and their families desperately needed. This particular skill, you came to understand, existed somewhere between the clinical detachment your training had emphasized and the complete emotional immersion that might have proven unsustainable across years of repeated exposure to loss. You developed your own particular methods for managing this delicate balance over time, learning to fully honor the gravity of each individual loss while also developing sufficient resilience to continue functioning effectively for the many other patients who remained under your care. You allowed yourself genuine moments of grief, sometimes shared quietly with trusted colleagues who understood exactly what you were experiencing, sometimes processed privately during your walks home or in quiet moments before sleep. Yet you also learned to compartmentalize sufficiently that this grief never entirely overwhelmed your capacity to remain present and effective for your next patient, whose own needs demanded your full attention regardless of whatever emotional weight you might still be carrying from a previous loss. The particular families you supported during these difficult transitions taught you as much as any textbook ever had about what genuine comfort actually required. You learned, through their reactions, when your presence provided genuine solace, and when perhaps a different approach might serve them better, when they needed practical information about what to expect, and when they simply needed someone to sit quietly beside them, offering silent companionship through their grief, rather than words that might feel inadequate to the enormity of what they were experiencing. You remembered specific moments from across your career when this particular skill, entirely unaddressed by your formal training, proved essential to providing genuinely meaningful care. A husband struggling to accept his wife's terminal diagnosis, whom you simply sat beside for an extended period, saying little but ensuring he understood he was not alone in that particular moment. A young mother facing an impossible decision regarding her child's treatment, for whom you provided not medical advice beyond your proper scope, but simply steady, compassionate presence as she worked through an agonizing choice no parent should ever have to make. Looking back across your entire career, you recognize that this particular education, learned entirely through direct experience rather than any classroom instruction, ultimately proved just as essential to your effectiveness as a nurse as anything you had formally studied during your training. The technical skills provided the necessary foundation, certainly, but this deeper capacity for authentic presence amid suffering, for offering genuine comfort when medicine itself had reached the limits of what it could accomplish, represented perhaps the truest measure of what it meant to practice nursing as more than merely a technical profession. There was no applause waiting for you at the end of a shift, no headline crediting your steady hands, but there was a quiet, private pride that settled into your chest each time a patient walked out healthier than they walked in, a satisfaction that needed no audience to feel complete. This particular quality of professional fulfillment developed gradually throughout your career, distinct from anything you might have anticipated during your earlier, more idealistic years of training when you perhaps imagined nursing might bring more visible forms of recognition and gratitude. You learned instead to locate your satisfaction in smaller, more private moments, a patient's steady progress noted quietly in their chart, a family's visible relief as their loved one's condition finally stabilized, the simple, unremarked-upon fact of having provided competent, compassionate care to another human being during their moment of genuine vulnerability. You remembered specific instances throughout your career when this particular pride felt especially acute. A difficult recovery you had personally shepherded through weeks of careful monitoring and gentle encouragement. A frightened patient whose confidence you had gradually helped rebuild through countless small interactions. A family whose fear you had helped transform into cautious hope through your consistent, reassuring presence throughout their loved one's treatment. These moments rarely received any formal acknowledgement beyond perhaps a brief thank you offered by a departing patient or grateful family member, yet they carried their own profound significance nonetheless. You developed, over time, a particular internal barometer for measuring your own professional success, one that had little to do with external validation and everything to do with your own private assessment of whether you had provided genuinely excellent care to each patient under your responsibility. This internal standard, you came to realize, ultimately proved more sustainable and meaningful than any external recognition might have offered, allowing you to maintain genuine professional satisfaction even during years when your specific contributions remained largely invisible to anyone beyond your immediate patients and their families. There was a particular quality to watching a patient's physical transformation across their hospital stay that never entirely lost its power to move you, regardless of how many times you witnessed this particular arc throughout your career. A patient who had arrived pale and frightened, barely able to speak through their pain, gradually regaining colour, strength, and eventually genuine humour as their condition improved under your consistent care. You watched this particular transformation countless times across your decades of nursing work, and each instance carried its own distinct satisfaction, proof positive that your careful attention and technical competence had contributed meaningfully to another person's genuine recovery. You remembered too the particular pride you felt watching younger nurses you had personally trained gradually develop into confident, skilled practitioners in their own right, recognizing in their growing competence the echo of your own earlier development under the patient guidance of more experienced colleagues. This particular form of professional legacy, passed forward through direct mentorship rather than any formal recognition, provided its own distinct satisfaction, a sense that your accumulated knowledge and skill would continue benefiting patients long after your own direct involvement in their care had ended. The absence of more visible public recognition for nursing work you eventually came to understand reflected something significant about the profession's fundamental nature rather than any genuine deficiency in its importance or value. Nursing succeeded most completely precisely when it remained largely invisible, when patients recovered smoothly enough that the countless small interventions required to achieve that recovery faded into unremarkable background rather than dramatic, visible triumph. This particular quality of quiet, largely unheralded excellence you gradually recognized represented one of the profession's most distinctive and admirable characteristics. You carried this particular understanding with you throughout the remainder of your career, finding genuine peace in work that rarely offered dramatic public acknowledgement, but which nonetheless provided consistent, meaningful contribution to countless individual lives across your decades of service. Even now, reflecting back across your entire nursing career, you recognize that this particular quality of quiet, private satisfaction, this pride that required no external audience to feel entirely complete, represented perhaps the most sustainable and ultimately meaningful form of professional fulfillment you could have hoped to discover within any career, medical or otherwise. You cannot fully explain the bond that forms between people who've held the same difficult nights together, who have caught each other's mistakes and covered each other's tears in the supply closet. Those friendships, built in exhaustion and quiet crisis, often outlasted marriages, jobs, and decades of distance. You often found yourself attempting to describe this particular quality of friendship to people outside the nursing profession, family members or acquaintances who had never experienced the specific intensity of bonds formed through shared, demanding crisis work, and you generally struggled to convey exactly what made these particular relationships so distinctly different from ordinary friendship. There was something about having witnessed a colleague at her absolute limit, exhausted beyond ordinary measure, yet still somehow finding the strength to continue caring competently for her patients, that created a particular quality of respect and connection, unlike anything you experienced in relationships formed under more ordinary circumstances. You remembered specific nights throughout your career when this particular bond revealed itself most powerfully, moments of genuine crisis when a colleague's steady support proved absolutely essential to your own ability to continue functioning effectively. A particularly difficult night when multiple patients required urgent attention simultaneously, when you and a fellow nurse worked seamlessly together without needing to exchange more than a few essential words, each of you instinctively understanding what the other required to manage the overwhelming demands of that particular shift. These experiences created a foundation of trust that extended naturally beyond the immediate crisis itself, informing how you related to these particular colleagues even during more ordinary, less demanding shifts. You developed an almost instinctive understanding with certain nurses, an ability to anticipate their needs and offer support before they even needed to ask, born entirely from having weathered genuine crisis together and discovered, through that shared experience, precisely how reliable and competent your colleague truly was when circumstances demanded their absolute best effort. You remembered, too, the particular vulnerability that emerged during quiet moments following especially difficult shifts, tears shared in the privacy of the supply closet after losing a patient you had both grown attached to, frustrations vented honestly about difficult doctors or administrative decisions that felt genuinely unfair, fears expressed about your own capacity to continue managing the emotional weight this work regularly demanded. These particular moments of shared vulnerability, witnessed by colleagues who understood exactly what you were experiencing because they too had felt it themselves, created bonds of genuine intimacy that few relationships outside this particular professional context ever quite achieved. You maintained several of these particular friendships across decades, long after you and your colleagues had moved to different hospitals or even retired entirely from active nursing work. You remembered periodic reunions with former colleagues, gatherings that inevitably began with updates about children and grandchildren, but gradually shifted toward reminiscence about specific patients and shared experiences from your working years together. Memories that remained vivid and significant regardless of how many decades had passed since the actual events themselves occurred. There was something particularly remarkable, you often reflected, about friendships capable of surviving such extended periods of physical distance and limited contact. Relationships that could resume with genuine warmth and understanding, even after years without direct communication, simply because the foundation established through shared professional crisis proved so fundamentally sturdy that ordinary distance and time seemed incapable of eroding it significantly. You experienced this phenomenon repeatedly throughout your later years, reconnecting with former colleagues at various reunions or chance encounters, finding the particular quality of your friendship immediately familiar despite whatever changes time had brought to both your lives. You recognized, too, that these particular friendships had sustained you through difficult periods extending well beyond your actual working years. Former colleagues who remained available for genuine support during personal crises entirely unrelated to nursing work itself. Relationships that had transformed gradually from purely professional connection into something resembling genuine, lifelong friendship, built on a foundation few other relationships in your life could match for its particular intensity and authenticity. Looking back across your entire career, you recognize these particular friendships, forged through shared exhaustion and crisis rather than more conventional circumstances, as among the most valuable and enduring relationships your nursing career had provided you. They represented, in their own quiet way, perhaps the truest testament to the particular character required to sustain a genuine nursing career. Women who understood, through direct shared experience, exactly what this demanding profession required, and who remained bound together by that understanding regardless of whatever distance, time and circumstance might otherwise have placed between you. Little by little, through the decade, something began to shift in how people spoke about nursing. A quiet recognition that this was not merely women's work, but a skill demanding intellect, precision, and extraordinary composure. You felt it in small ways: a doctor's nod, a patient's gratitude, a newspaper article that finally used the word profession without hesitation. You remembered the earlier years of your career when this particular recognition remained considerably more elusive, when nursing was frequently characterized, even by well-meaning individuals, as a natural extension of women's supposedly innate caretaking instincts rather than a genuinely skilled profession requiring extensive training and continued professional development. This particular framing, however unintentional its condescension might have been, nonetheless diminished the genuine expertise and technical competence your work actually required, positioning it instead as merely an expression of feminine nature rather than hard-won professional achievement. You noticed the gradual shift most clearly, perhaps, in how physicians began approaching their interactions with nursing staff over the course of your career. The collaborative respect demonstrated by certain doctors becoming somewhat less exceptional and more commonly expected as the decade progressed. You remembered specific conversations with younger doctors entering the profession during your later years of nursing work. Physicians who approached nursing observations with genuine curiosity and respect from their very first interactions, having apparently absorbed, through their own more recent training, a somewhat different understanding of appropriate collaborative relationships between doctors and nurses than had been common practice during your own earlier years. The broader public conversation about nursing seemed to shift gradually too, you noticed, reading occasional newspaper articles or magazine features that began treating nursing with somewhat greater seriousness and respect than had been typical during earlier decades. You remembered one particular article you encountered during these years, a lengthy feature exploring the technical complexity and genuine professional expertise nursing actually required, written with a tone of genuine respect that felt refreshingly different from the more condescending characterizations you'd grown accustomed to encountering throughout your earlier career. This particular shift, you recognized, remained gradual and incomplete, even by the decade's conclusion, certain persistent attitudes proving remarkably resistant to change, despite the broader evolution occurring around them. Yet you nonetheless felt genuine encouragement observing even this partial transformation, recognizing in it perhaps the early stages of a longer process that might eventually lead toward fuller professional recognition for nursing's genuine complexity and importance. You remembered specific moments when this evolving recognition felt particularly meaningful to you personally, a young intern who approached you directly during his first week on the ward, explaining that his own medical training had specifically emphasized the importance of genuinely collaborating with nursing staff rather than simply issuing directives without meaningful consultation. This particular young doctor's attitude, you recognized, represented something genuinely different from what you'd encountered from most physicians during your earlier years. Evidence that broader institutional attitudes within medical training itself might be gradually shifting toward greater appreciation for nursing expertise. You also noticed this evolving recognition reflected in how nursing organizations themselves began advocating more assertively for professional standards and continued education requirements, positioning nursing more explicitly as a genuine profession, deserving the same seriousness and respect typically afforded to other skilled occupations. You attended several professional conferences during these later years of your career, encountering discussions and presentations that treated nursing's technical and intellectual demands with a seriousness that felt notably different from the more limited professional development opportunities available during your earlier training years. This gradual evolution never fully eliminated certain persistent challenges you continued encountering throughout the remainder of your career. Moments when particular doctors or administrators still treated nursing expertise with insufficient respect. Situations when broader institutional structures still fail to fully recognize the genuine complexity your daily work required. Yet you nonetheless found genuine encouragement in the overall trajectory you observed developing across this particular decade. A sense that the profession you had dedicated your working life toward was gradually, however incompletely, achieving greater recognition for its genuine value and complexity. Looking back from your later years at this particular period of gradual transformation, you recognized it as an important, if incomplete, chapter within the longer history of nursing's evolution as a genuine profession. You felt grateful to have witnessed even this partial shift during your own working years, recognizing that younger nurses entering the profession in subsequent decades would likely encounter considerably more consistent professional respect than had been typical during your own earlier experiences, a gradual but genuine progress that felt meaningful to have observed unfolding incrementally across your own extended career. Even after you hung up your uniform for the night, some part of you never quite left the ward, some quiet vigilance that stayed switched on long after the lights went out. You would lie awake sometimes, running through the day's patients like a rosary, hoping you had done enough, knowing tomorrow you would rise and do it all again. This particular quality of persistent, low-level vigilance developed gradually throughout your career, an almost involuntary mental habit that continued operating regardless of whether you were actively working or simply attempting to rest at home after a difficult shift. You remembered noticing this pattern most clearly during your earlier years of nursing, surprised initially by how completely your mind remained occupied with hospital concerns, even during hours technically devoted to your own rest and recovery. You developed, over time, a particular ritual for managing this persistent mental activity, mentally reviewing each patient under your care during your walk home or during quiet moments before sleep, ensuring you had properly documented every important observation, confirming in your own mind that you had provided appropriately thorough care throughout your shift. This review process, though sometimes exhausting in its thoroughness, ultimately provided its own particular comfort, a sense of having genuinely fulfilled your professional responsibilities completely before allowing yourself to finally rest. There were certain nights, you remembered, when this particular vigilance proved considerably more intense than others, following especially difficult shifts involving patients whose conditions remained genuinely uncertain, whose recovery seemed to hang in a delicate balance that no amount of careful nursing care could entirely guarantee. You would lie awake during these particular nights, running through every detail of your care for these specific patients, questioning whether you had missed some crucial observation, whether some different approach might have provided more effective comfort or treatment. Your husband, during the years of your marriage, grew accustomed to this particular pattern, learning to recognize the specific quality of distraction that indicated your mind remained occupied with hospital concerns even during your shared evenings at home. He developed his own particular methods for helping you gradually transition away from this persistent professional preoccupation. Gentle conversation about ordinary domestic matters, quiet companionship that didn't demand your full verbal engagement, but nonetheless provided comfortable distraction from whatever specific worries occupied your thoughts. You learned, gradually, various techniques for managing this particular mental habit more effectively, recognizing that complete elimination proved impossible given the genuine emotional investment your work required, yet finding ways to prevent it from entirely overwhelming your capacity for rest and personal life beyond the hospital. You developed specific mental rituals for concluding your daily review, a deliberate decision to set aside further worry once you had thoroughly considered each patient's situation, trusting that you had done everything reasonably possible within your professional capacity, and that further anxious rumination would serve no genuine purpose beyond depriving yourself of necessary rest. This particular quality of persistent professional vigilance you eventually came to recognize represented both a genuine burden and, in its own way, evidence of the deep personal investment you brought to your nursing work throughout your entire career. You could have perhaps cultivated greater emotional distance from your patients, treating your work with a purely functional detachment that might have allowed easier separation between professional and personal life. Yet you recognize, too, that this same emotional investment, this genuine care that followed you home each evening, ultimately made you a more attentive and effective nurse than a more purely detached approach might have achieved. You carried this particular pattern with you across your entire career, through decades of demanding shifts, through countless patients whose faces and specific circumstances remained vivid in your memory long after their actual treatment had concluded. Even now, so many years removed from active nursing work, you occasionally find yourself experiencing echoes of this same pattern, waking briefly during the night with sudden, urgent concern about some task left incomplete, before gradually remembering that your working years have long since concluded, that whatever patients currently occupy hospital beds throughout your city now depend on other capable hands rather than your own direct intervention. This realization, arriving now with a mixture of relief and something resembling gentle nostalgia, reminds you of just how completely your nursing career shaped your fundamental character, how deeply this particular quality of vigilant, persistent care became woven into your basic identity across decades of dedicated professional service, a quality that persisted in diminished but still recognizable form long after your actual working years had finally, gently drawn to their conclusion. And so the shift ends, the way it always did, quietly, without fanfare. The cap comes off. The starch softens. Somewhere behind her, a ward full of strangers sleeps a little easier because she sat with them, because she remembered their names, because she noticed the small things no chart could ever capture. Think about her tonight, and about all the women like her, the ones who pinned back their hair before dawn and walked into rooms full of fear and simply stayed, who folded linens with more care than the task required, who learned to hum softly so a child would stop trembling, who held a stranger's hand in the middle of the night because no one else could. They didn't think of themselves as remarkable. They thought of themselves as doing their job, the next task, the next patient, the next long walk home in the dark. There is something in that we have lost a little of, the willingness to simply show up for someone else without needing to be seen doing it. So maybe tonight, take just a little of her with you. The next time someone you love is frightened, sit a little longer than you need to. The next time a stranger needs kindness, offer it quietly without expecting thanks. Slow down enough to notice the person in front of you the way she always did. History is not only found in headlines and inventions. Sometimes it's a hand held through a long night, a hallway walked in soft shoes, a promise kept simply by staying. And that has always been enough. So let your body settle now, the way hers finally did at the end of every long shift. The ward is quiet, the lights are low, everyone you love is safe, and so are you. Good night.